He built an empire without firing a single shot and lost it the same way. A quiet ruler who controlled 6 states with just a stare. But the moment one whisper slipped through his walls of silence, everything he'd built began to crack. Bodies vanished. Allies broke. The FBI closed in. And the king who feared nothing suddenly realized the true threat wasn't the law, it was the man sitting closest to him. What happened next would rewrite the underworld forever. Federal Hill at the turn of the 20th century was no place for the soft or the hopeful. It was a cramped chunk of Providence where the smell of simmering tomato sauce mixed with coal smoke, where church bells tried, but failed, to drown out the curses of factory whistles. It was a neighborhood built on the cracked backs of immigrants, most of them Italian, most of them poor, and all of them fighting for a place in a country that barely tolerated their presence. This was the world into which Raymond Patriarca opened his eyes. The tenements on Atwell's Avenue were stacked like crooked teeth, stuffed with families who had come across the Atlantic with more dreams than money. Their days were shaped by hunger, hope, and the hard reality that America, this supposedly shining country, had little interest in making life easy for anyone with a foreign name. Inside one of those dim apartments lived the Patriarca family, Aloysius, his wife, and their small son Raymond. From the beginning, Raymond learned that life was a kind of war, one fought not with bullets, but with endurance. His father rose before the sun and came home after it set, his hands cracked and raw from hauling cargo on the docks. Every night, those hands trembled from exhaustion as he tried to eat. Every night, Raymond watched silently from the corner of the kitchen. He absorbed everything. He saw poverty grind a proud man into a shadow of himself. He saw the way landlords spoke to his father, with impatience, with condescension, with the unspoken reminder that Italians were second-class citizens. He saw the signs in shop windows that said, "No Italians need apply." For most boys, these sights might have inspired sadness. For Raymond, they sparked something harder, sharper, colder. But on the streets, another lesson waited for him. Federal Hill had its men of respect, figures who moved through the neighborhood in clean suits and polished shoes while everyone else smelled of sweat and factory grime. They played cards outside cafes, carried themselves with confidence, and never hurried for anyone. People stepped aside when they passed. Shopkeepers greeted them with careful smiles. Cops nodded and looked the other way. They weren't politicians. They weren't businessmen. They weren't saints. These were underworld men. The bookmakers, the enforcers, the fixers, the quiet power brokers of an Italian community that trusted itself more than it trusted the American government.
Some were violent.
Some simply had the aura of violence. But all possessed something Raymond recognized instantly.
Power.
The one thing his father worked for, but never received. He caught glimpses of them as he ran errands for his mother. A man in a gray suit standing in the doorway of a cafe, whispering instructions to someone who nodded fearfully. Another man handing out cash outside a grocery store, solving disputes that no police officer would ever bother with. These men weren't good. They weren't clean. But they were respected. And for a boy growing up in a world that treated his family like they were invisible, respect looked like salvation. Raymond was quiet by nature, not timid, but calculating. He spoke little, listened often, and watched everything. By the time he was 10, he could tell the difference between a man who wanted trouble and a man who meant it. He could read faces the way most boys read newspapers. He learned early that the truth was rarely spoken aloud on Federal Hill. It was carried in gestures, in silences, in the shifting of eyes. This sensitivity to danger would one day save his life, more times than he could count. But the moment that changed everything arrived on January 17, 1920, a day burned into the history of America and into the destiny of every ambitious young man on the street. The Volstead Act outlawed alcohol with the stroke of a pen. Overnight, millions of Americans were told they could no longer buy the one product nearly everyone wanted. The government believed it could legislate morality. Instead, it created a gold mine. And in neighborhoods like Federal Hill, opportunity lit up the night like a flare. Ships filled with Canadian whiskey hovered off the Rhode Island coast. Small boats made midnight runs to secret coves. Bar owners paid cash for crates of bottles that had never seen a legal label. Every man with a boat, a backroom, or a bit of nerve joined the new underground economy. Smuggling was suddenly the most profitable business in New England. And Raymond, still just a teenager, saw it happen in real time. Men who had once begged for work were now dressed in fine coats. Families that had been living on bread crusts suddenly had new furniture. And those quiet, well-respected neighborhood figures? They became something else entirely.
Kings.
Raymond didn't hesitate. He didn't need encouragement or permission. He simply moved toward the light of opportunity as naturally as a moth moves to flame. At first, it was small things, running messages between bookmakers, carrying envelopes for bootleggers, passing notes that no adult wanted to be caught holding. He didn't ask questions. He didn't look inside packages. He didn't brag. And that made him valuable. Other boys sought attention. Raymond sought understanding. Other boys competed for approval. Raymond earned it without trying. Other boys made noise. Raymond made impressions. The neighborhood started referring to him in whispers, nothing dramatic, just mentions, murmurs, nods. That Patriarca kid knows how to keep quiet. Smart boy, that one. He'll be something someday. For most people, praise was harmless. For young Raymond Patriarca, praise was fuel. He soon learned the truth that defined him. Honest work kept you poor. But power? Power could change the fate of a community. Power could rewrite a man's destiny. Power could make the world kneel. By the time he touched adulthood, his path was no longer just forming. It was carved into the stone of Federal Hill. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, and he wasn't eager for trouble. But he had that rare combination of intelligence, discipline, and patience that older men recognized instantly. The streets already knew who he was. And long before the law caught his scent, Federal Hill was whispering a prophecy. That boy, Raymond, he's gonna run this place one day. Welcome, my beautiful family and friends, to my YouTube channel. Please click on subscribe, like, comment, and share this video. Thank you specially for sticking around to this very moment. Now back to the story. Prison is supposed to break a man. For Raymond Patriarca, it became the place where he was rebuilt. He entered the state penitentiary young, too young, some said, to be thrown into a world of steel bars and hardened criminals. But the moment the gates clanged shut behind him, he understood something essential. This wasn't punishment. This was education. Inside those walls lived every type of outlaw. Thieves with nimble hands, safecrackers with nerves of ice, gunmen with dead eyes, and schemers whose minds worked like chessboards. Men who had survived street wars, double crosses, and police raids. Men who had lived 10 lives in one. Men who knew how America's hidden systems truly worked. Most inmates spent their days complaining, brawling, sleeping, wasting time. Not Raymond. He observed. He listened. He pieced together the unwritten rules of power like a scholar parsing an ancient text. Prison became his classroom, and its deadliest men became his teachers. He studied how the Irish ran their rackets with intimidation. How the Jews built their operations with business precision. How Italian crews remained silent, loyal, and invisible when they needed to be. He learned what made a crew strong and what made it fall apart. He memorized the warning signs of betrayal. He watched how a single rumor could turn one man into a target and another into a leader. Every conversation was a lesson. Every fight in the yard was a case study. Every guard who could be bribed was proof that power existed even in the most controlled of places. By the time his sentence ended, Patriarca was no longer the quick-footed young runner from Federal Hill. He walked out with a new identity, a quiet, coiled confidence that unsettled even the men who had known him before. Something cold lived behind his eyes now. Something disciplined. Something dangerous. He didn't swagger. He didn't boast. He simply measured everything: angles, risks, outcomes, people. On the outside, prohibition was fading, but the underworld was not. Bootleggers who had gotten rich fast were now going broke faster. Violence was everywhere. Young men with guns were dying in alleys over turf worth less than a bag of sugar. Everyone was chasing the last drops of liquor money, like starving wolves chasing a carcass. Patriarca wanted no part of that chaos. He wasn't built to burn bright. He was built to endure. While the other mobs scrambled for territory and bloodied themselves over bars and rum-running routes, Raymond chose a different path. He built quietly. He built smartly. He built for the long game. He understood something few of his peers did. When Prohibition ended, the men still clinging to bootlegging would die out with it. But the underworld? The underworld would always exist. So, he diversified. Numbers rackets. They were simple, steady, and profitable. The working class loved dreaming of impossible luck. Patriarca made sure those dreams flowed through his ledgers. Loan sharking. A man who borrows money becomes a man who owes loyalty, sometimes forever. Unions. This was the true gold mine. Whoever controlled labor controlled the docks, the construction sites, the shipping routes, and the flow of cash through Rhode Island's most vital businesses. Raymond didn't bully his way in. He inserted himself quietly, backing one foreman here, removing another there, turning favors into influence and influence into command. Politicians. They were the easiest to understand. They all wanted two things, money and re-election. Raymond provided both. And in return, they provided silence. Slowly, he became the man people went to when they needed something done discreetly. The man who could move votes. The man who could make a problem disappear in exchange for a simple nod of loyalty. He wasn't a brute. He wasn't a showman. He wasn't a man who needed to raise his voice. His danger lay in his clarity. His strength lay in his patience. His power lay in his cold, controlled logic. While other criminals acted on impulse, Raymond acted on calculations. While others chased fast money, he built structures that would last decades. While others relied on intimidation, he relied on consistency and the quiet threat behind his eyes. He never touched drugs. He never got drunk. He never gambled. He never lost control. His discipline made him different. His discipline made him respected. His discipline made him feared. And as the years passed, he began weaving threads no one else could see. Not until it was too late. He connected bookmakers from Providence to Boston. He consolidated gambling operations that had been fragmented for generations. He placed loyal men in key positions in unions across New England. He forged alliances with crime families in New York while ensuring New England kept its independence. Piece by piece, he constructed a territory that didn't look like territory at all. It looked like ordinary life. Gas stations, diners, trucking companies, vending routes, bars, factories, shipping yards, all seemingly unrelated, yet quietly tied back to him. He was building something New England had never witnessed. A unified criminal empire. Not a street gang. Not a loose consortium of hoodlums. Not a racketeering crew. An empire, structured, organized, strategic, efficient. People began to sense it. Detectives whispered about his rise. Politicians stepped carefully around his name. Small-time gangsters either aligned with him or vanished quietly from the scene. He was no longer just Raymond Patriarca. He was a force, an emerging dawn in everything but title. And yet, the most remarkable part was how invisible he remained. Others made headlines. Others posed for photographs in expensive suits. Others bragged about territories and money. But Raymond? He did the opposite. He kept his suits plain, his movements predictable, his footprint small. He cultivated the illusion of a man who lived modestly, who simply worked hard, who barely made waves. He let everyone underestimate him. And while they did, he built the foundation of the empire that would one day make him the most powerful mafia boss in New England's history. Not through bloodshed, not through chaos, but through strategy, through patience, through transformation. This was no longer the boy born in the shadows of Federal Hill. This was a man stepping into his future, one calculated move at a time. The most powerful criminal empire in New England wasn't run from a penthouse suite, a marble office, or a mansion guarded by armed soldiers. It was run from a vending machine repair shop, a squat brick building at 168 Atwells Avenue, squeezed between a bakery and a boarded-up storefront. Anyone passing by would see nothing unusual. A few cigarette machines stacked near the window. A dusty neon sign. A couple of old men smoking on the sidewalk. The place looked like the type of business that barely paid its rent. But inside, behind a plain desk and a scuffed floor, sat Raymond Patriarca, the most feared man north of New York. There were no gold rings on his fingers, no tailored silk suits, no thick chains or outward signs of wealth. Just a simple shirt, a cold stare, and a voice that rarely rose above a whisper. Because Patriarca didn't need noise to command respect. His power lived in the silence. Men entered the shop the way Catholics approached confession, tense, uncertain, desperate. Bookmakers came in with envelopes of cash. Union officials came in with problems. Politicians came in with favors they needed resolved quickly. Businessmen came in with complaints, requests, apologies. Some walked out relieved, lighter than they'd entered. Others walked out with their faces drained of color, already imagining the inevitable knock on their door later that night. Patriarca never shouted. He rarely threatened. He never repeated himself. He didn't have to. His rulings carried a chilling clarity. Whether he was authorizing a loan, approving a union move, settling a dispute between crews, or ordering a death, everything he did was guided by a single principle. Control is silent. Chaos is loud. Inside the shop, conversations were short and purposeful.
Sit.
What's the issue? Show me. All right. Go. A nod from him could change a man's fortune. A stare could erase it entirely. Men who worked for him said the same thing. It wasn't what he said. It was what he didn't say. He ruled with calm precision, the way a surgeon wields a scalpel. Never messy. Never emotional. Never impulsive. If violence was required, he didn't indulge in theatrics. There were no public beatings, no flamboyant displays of dominance. He preferred something simpler. A quiet phone call. A short instruction. A name.
A time.
A place. The job would be done with minimal noise, minimal witnesses, and maximum efficiency. To the outside world, it always looked like an accident, a robbery gone wrong, a dispute unrelated to him. To his men, the message was clear. Cross him only once. There is no second chance. But Patriarca was equally strategic with mercy. He understood that fear built obedience, but loyalty built empires. If a man made a mistake out of panic, poor judgment, or desperation, but proved himself valuable, Patriarca sometimes spared him. Not because he was compassionate, but because sparing one man could bind 10 others to him. His mercy was a tool, never a weakness. And everyone knew that the Don who granted mercy today could withdraw it tomorrow. The shop at Atwell's Avenue became the nerve center of New England's underworld. From that modest room, Patriarca oversaw gambling rings from Providence to Worcester, loan operations that stretched into Connecticut, bookmakers in Boston, and Union territories across 6 states. All of it held together not by fear alone, but by omerta, the ancient code of silence. Patriarca didn't just enforce omerta. He believed in it, practiced it, weaponized it. His men spoke carefully, cautiously. His lieutenants communicated in hints, not details. Even his closest associates never knew more than they absolutely needed to. The walls of that little shop absorbed thousands of conversations but betrayed none. Even the FBI, who would eventually wiretap almost everything around him, found themselves frustrated. The man simply didn't talk. He didn't brag about killings. He didn't gossip about rival families. He didn't discuss business unnecessarily. His silence wasn't just a habit, it was a strategy, a shield, a language all its own. And it made him unknowable. Detectives watching him described him as controlled, cold, emotionless, a man you couldn't read. Politicians whispered his name with a mix of fear and respect. Ordinary citizens didn't dare speak of him at all, because everyone understood the truth. You didn't have to meet Patriarca to be under his shadow. His presence circled New England like an invisible tide. Whoever owed money eventually owed it to him. Whoever controlled a union eventually reported to him. Whoever wanted peace needed his approval. Whoever made trouble needed his permission. Yet the man who held so much power still arrived at the shop early each morning, unlocked the door himself, and sat behind that worn wooden desk as if it were a throne no one recognized. And in a way, it was. Inside those cramped walls, he became something different, something larger than the criminals, the politicians, even the law itself. A governor without a title, a judge without a courtroom, a king without a crown, all from a room the size of a small kitchen. His lieutenants called it the office. The FBI called it the Providence headquarters. But among the locals, it had only one name: the House of Silence. A place where fortunes shifted quietly, where destinies were sealed behind cheap blinds and humming vending machines, where a man with no flash and no vanity controlled more power than most senators. This was not the Mafia of New York, loud, flamboyant, dramatic. This was the New England Mafia.
Disciplined.
Secretive. Tightly wound around one man's will. Raymond Patriarca's empire didn't grow through bloodshed. It thrived through order. He didn't bully the streets. He owned them through efficiency. He didn't seek fame. He preferred myth. In the end, his greatest weapon wasn't a gun, a knife, or even a crew. It was his silence. A silence that commanded rooms. A silence that froze men in place. A silence that built the most formidable criminal network New England had ever known. And in that silence, inside that unremarkable shop on Atwell's Avenue, the legend of a Don solidified, quietly, completely, and without a single wasted word. By the late 1950s, the quiet empire Raymond Patriarca built on Atwell's Avenue began to attract the kind of attention no criminal boss ever wants: federal attention. The FBI had been watching him for years, circling like wolves, gathering scraps, interviewing ghosts, chasing rumors. For a long time, they came up empty. Patriarca's silence was impenetrable, his discipline legendary. His men didn't talk. His enemies didn't survive. His operation left barely a footprint. But Washington had grown tired of chasing shadows. A decision came down from the top. Find something. Anything. I don't care how small. Get inside. And so began the most aggressive surveillance campaign New England had ever seen. It started quietly. 2 agents in trench coats drinking bad coffee across the street. Parked cars that stayed too long. New faces pretending to read newspapers while watching the shop door. Patriarca noticed. He always noticed, but he didn't react. He simply filed it away. Then came the bugs. Hidden microphones were slipped into telephones, planted in ceilings, embedded behind walls of the vending machine shop. The FBI wired anything they could touch: fans, ashtrays, even a ceramic Jesus statue someone placed near the counter. Tape recorders spun day and night in a cramped government office, capturing every cough, every shuffle of feet, every muttered sentence. And for the first time in his life, Raymond's whispers were no longer private. The federal agents learned something quickly. He didn't talk much, but the men who visited him did. Bookmakers, soldiers, union bosses, mid-level hustlers, they walked in with reverence and nerves. And sometimes, under stress, they let things slip. A complaint about a rival. A mention of a payment. A question about handling someone. Every crumb mattered. The noose tightened. But Patriarca adapted faster than the FBI expected. Meetings moved outdoors. Long walks in parking lots, conversations while sitting on stoops, coded gestures exchanged on sidewalks under the open sky. When he had to speak, his sentences were short, ambiguous, wrapped in layers of meaning. Take care of that situation, he'd say, giving no name, no place, no explicit instruction. To the FBI listening through static, it was maddening. To his men, it was crystal clear. Eventually, he stopped talking on the phone altogether. Calls were answered with one phrase: "Come see me." But even that wasn't enough. Word reached Raymond through channels he trusted. Someone might be talking. An informant. A traitor. A crack within the wall of silence. Patriarca didn't panic. Panic was for amateurs. He simply watched. Who hesitated before answering a question. Who avoided eye contact. Who drank too much, spent too much, owed too much. He studied his men with the same cold precision he had studied killers and thieves in prison. And one by one, suspects began to appear. Then the bodies disappeared. Some were found months later. Some were never found at all. To the FBI, each missing man was a sign they were getting closer to something real. To Patriarca, each missing man was a necessary act of maintenance, removing the rust before it spread. But the pressure was building from all sides. Union turmoil, territorial disputes, rival crews testing boundaries, politicians becoming nervous as elections approached, and the FBI, always listening, always waiting, always tightening their grip. The shop at 168 Atwell's Avenue began to feel different. The same old walls now carried the weight of unseen ears. Every visitor looked over their shoulder. Every conversation felt like it had a shadow. The atmosphere thickened with tension. A bookmaker would enter sweating, clutching an envelope, his eyes darting around the room. A union man would sit down, swallow hard, and ask if the issue with a certain boss had been resolved. Patriarca would respond with a nod or a simple phrase, and they would leave, some relieved, others terrified. But the danger wasn't just in the streets or behind wiretaps. It was inside the organization itself. Because the higher the stakes grew, the more tempting betrayal became. A man facing prison might talk to save himself. A man facing debt might talk to wipe his slate clean. A man facing death might talk because he had nothing left to lose. And Patriarca understood this brutally well. So his trust shrank. His inner circle tightened. He delegated less. He observed more. His closest men noticed the change. The boss who once ruled with unshakable calm now showed hints, small, subtle hints, of strain. He slept less. He scrutinized notes twice. He paced more during walks. Not out of fear, but out of calculation. Because he knew a truth the FBI didn't. Empires don't fall from the outside. They fall from within. One slip, one loose tongue, one betrayal. That was all it would take. And every man around him, every soldier, every associate, every lieutenant, was a roll of the dice. The FBI's pressure campaign was working. Men were getting sloppy. They whispered too loudly. They complained too openly. They worried about indictments, subpoenas, arrests. Some cracked. Some disappeared. Some simply vanished from the organization without explanation. And those still loyal understood exactly what that meant. Raymond Patriarca's empire, once defined by silence, was entering a new phase, one shaped not by order, but by paranoia. He held it together with sheer force of will, adapting to every new federal tactic with sharper instincts, colder judgment, and fewer allies. But the walls were closing in. The shop felt smaller. The streets felt thinner. The shadows felt shorter. The FBI was no longer chasing whispers. They were catching them. And Raymond Patriarca knew that the next mistake, any mistake, could shatter everything he had built. Because in the growing darkness of Federal Hill, one truth echoed louder than ever. It wasn't the cops he feared. It was his own men, the ones who might stop whispering and start talking. By the late 1960s, the streets of New England were no longer quiet. What began as whispers in Patriarca's shop had turned into shouts, threats, and eventually, gunfire. The once orderly empire, built on discipline and silence, was now cracking under pressure from all sides. And in the cracks, blood began to seep. It started with small eruptions. A beating here, a missing man there. But soon the violence became open, raw, unavoidable. New England was turning into a battlefield, and the battles had names. Baby Katawa, a gambler who crossed the wrong man and ended up face down in a parking lot, a neat hole behind his ear. His name became the first drop in a storm. Eddie Deegan, a Boston outlaw whose murder set half the underworld on fire. When his body was found, cold and stiff in an alley, it didn't just cause panic. It triggered a chain reaction the FBI had been waiting for. William Mafia, an old loan shark who knew too much and talked too freely. His death was the loudest message of all. The silence of the empire would be enforced by any means necessary. Each murder was like a flare launched into the night sky. And federal agents, already circling like hawks, saw every spark. They began connecting dots. Patterns emerged on chalkboards. Suspects turned into witnesses. Witnesses turned into informants. Informants turned into bodies. Every time the FBI got close, someone either changed their story or stopped breathing. And through it all, somewhere behind the scenes, one name hovered like smoke. Patriarca. He wasn't pulling the trigger. He wasn't standing over bodies. He didn't need to. His empire told men who to kill and when. His nods, his silences, his coded phrases, they were enough to start wars. The FBI knew it. They just couldn't prove it.
Not yet.
But the violence kept rising, impossible to ignore. Barrooms shook with rumors. Union halls buzzed with fear. Men spoke in half-sentences and incomplete thoughts, terrified that a full sentence might condemn them. Everywhere, pressure mounted. Patriarca himself remained calm, collected, disciplined as always. But beneath the surface, he was fighting a war on three fronts. Against rivals testing his power. Against traitors within his ranks. Against federal agents who were no longer knocking, they were breaking down the door. Tape recorders spun like clockwork in FBI surveillance rooms. Each reel added another layer to the case. Agents smoked cigarettes and leaned in close, scribbling notes as they replayed every murmur, every coded word, every sound of a chair scraping the floor in Patriarca's shop. What does he mean by handle it? Who's this guy they're talking about? Play it again slower. What the FBI heard wasn't enough for a murder conviction. Not yet. But it was enough to keep tightening the noose. Meanwhile, out in the streets, violence became currency. Men killed to prove loyalty. Men killed to settle debts. Men killed because staying alive meant burying someone else first. The mob war, or what looked like one, wasn't caused by one single event. It was the accumulation of pressure. Too many ambitious young men. Too many grudges.
Too many secrets.
Too many feds listening. And too many bodies. The FBI realized something important. Every death led back to the same quiet source. Not directly. Not obviously. But undeniably. So they sharpened their strategy. Informants were squeezed harder. Underworld rivals were offered deals. Bookmakers were picked up and grilled. Union bosses were cornered. All hoping one person, just one, would crack. Eventually, someone did. The witness wasn't a hardened killer or a high-ranking associate. It was someone small, scared, and weak enough to save himself by pointing upward. One testimony. One statement. One trembling voice. And the federal government finally had what it needed. They struck fast. Indictments flew. Courtrooms filled. Reporters flooded Providence like vultures. And in the middle of it all stood the man who had ruled New England's underworld with nothing but discipline and quiet authority. Raymond Patriarca. For decades he had outmaneuvered the law. For decades he had stayed one step ahead. But now the system was coming down with its full weight. The charge wasn't murder. It was something more subtle and more dangerous. Conspiracy to commit murder. A phrase that was vague enough to catch him and powerful enough to put him away. The courtroom was silent when the verdict came down. A stillness settled over the room like dust.
Guilty.
Patriarca didn't flinch. He didn't scowl. He didn't curse. He simply blinked once, nodded to his lawyer, and stood. The Titan of Federal Hill was going to prison at 60 years old. But prison had never scared him. He'd been there before. He knew how it worked. He knew how to survive. And more importantly, he knew he wasn't walking into a cage. He was walking into an office. Behind bars, Patriarca moved with the same calm authority he had on Atwell's Avenue. He had lieutenants in other cell blocks. He had guards on his payroll. He had a network that reached far beyond the steel gates. Orders left his cell like smoke drifting through iron bars. Sometimes he spoke through visitors. Sometimes through coded letters. Sometimes through a simple look exchanged across a prison yard. His empire did not collapse. It shifted, adapted, tightened. While the FBI celebrated, while the newspapers crowed, while politicians smiled for cameras, the reality was far more complicated. The Dawn was behind bars, but the empire was still alive. Bleeding.
Bruised.
Shaken. But alive. And as long as Patriarca breathed, as long as his voice whispered through fences and hallways, as long as his commands found their way into the night. New England would never be free of him.
Not yet.
Not even in chains. When Raymond Patriarca stepped out of federal custody, he was no longer the sharp-eyed sovereign of New England's underworld. The man who once ruled with a whisper now returned home with oxygen tubes, trembling hands, and a heart that sputtered like an old engine. He had been released early, not because the court showed mercy, but because his body was decaying faster than the prison walls could contain him.
He was free, yes.
But it was the freedom of a man already halfway in the grave. Federal Hill looked the same at first glance. Brick storefronts, crowded sidewalks, the familiar smell of bread and cigarette smoke. But beneath the surface, the entire world had shifted. The old Mafia order he had mastered was gone, and the new one had no place for men like him. RICO had changed everything. Where once the FBI had chased individual crimes, now they hunted entire organizations. A conversation, a handshake, a favor, anything could be used as evidence. The same code of silence that kept Patriarca untouchable was now the very thing that put every man in a circle at risk. He returned to a landscape where every word was a liability. Even worse, the younger generation of criminals had embraced a world he despised.
Drugs.
Heroin.
Cocaine.
Fast money. Reckless bloodshed. No discipline. No structure. No respect. To Patriarca, drugs were poison, not just to the streets, but to the soul of the Mafia itself. They created addicts, informants, attention, chaos. They shortened lives and shortened tempers. And chaos was something he had spent decades stamping out. But while he was locked away, the young wolves had taken over. They didn't care about rules, didn't fear consequences, didn't understand the quiet brilliance of an empire built on unions and bookmaking and political influence. They wanted what the drug trade offered. Fast wealth, fast power, fast thrills. Patriarca's refusal to enter the narcotics business now looked like a weakness. A flaw. Some younger bosses viewed him as a relic, a man holding onto principles while the world sprinted past him. His once airtight empire was now leaking at every seam. The unions, once his bedrock of power, were compromised. Feds had infiltrated them, pressured them, flipped members from the inside. The bookmaking operations, steadier than any stock portfolio, were disrupted by new crews muscling in, new technologies, new risks. Boston, once orderly under his hand, had become a snake pit where every rival saw an opportunity to carve out their own territory. And the worst bleeding wasn't out there on the streets. It was inside his home. His son, Raymond Jr., was not the heir an empire required. The boy had grown up watching his father command respect with a nod, but he had never learned the discipline that shaped those nods. He inherited the Patriarca name, but not the Patriarca mind. He lacked the cold calculation, the patience, the instinctual understanding of men that made his father feared from Providence to Boston. To the father, this was a private heartbreak. To the empire, it was a public disaster. Associates began whispering the moment Patriarca Sr. stepped indoors. Junior's soft. He doesn't have it. He can't hold his family together. And Patriarca knew they were right. The greatest empire north of New York had been built on his discipline. Now it risked collapsing under his son's indecision. Inside his modest home on Federal Hill, the Don who once ruled 6 states now spent his days in a chair, an old wooden chair that had seen more secrets than any courtroom. Oxygen hissed from the tank beside him. Pill bottles lined the table. His empire's future lay in the hands of men he no longer trusted, and a son he knew would never fill his shoes. Every visitor who walked through his door could see the fragility hanging in the air. Patriarca still looked like the boss, sharp eyes, calm posture, an aura that could silence a room, but his body betrayed the truth. He couldn't stand without help. He couldn't walk without pain. And each night, he slept not like a king, but like a man fighting the inevitable. Yet, even in decline, his mind remained dangerous. He listened to every report. He asked the right questions. He analyzed every problem with the same quiet ruthlessness he always had. But the difference was this. Now he had fewer answers. and fewer soldiers willing to carry them out. Every corner of his empire felt like a battlefield. Old allies were dying off. New players were rising with no respect for the past. The FBI wasn't stalking shadows anymore. They were knocking down doors. And the enemies Patriarca thought he buried years ago were rising from the ground like ghosts. A man he once spared now plotted revenge. A rival crew he once crushed began rebuilding. A lieutenant he once trusted whispered to agents in back rooms. The world had become a place of shifting loyalties and simmering danger, and the dying king was forced to watch it crumble from the confines of his chair. In his final years, Patriarca often stared out the window at the neighborhood he once controlled completely. The sidewalks were filled with new faces, kids who didn't know his name, men who didn't fear him, families who had no idea that their quiet mornings were once shaped by the decisions he made with a flick of his fingers. He was watching his empire fade, watching his legacy blur, watching the empire of silence turn into noise. And in those moments, the great Don, who never showed emotion, never lost control, never displayed weakness, finally felt something close to sorrow. Not for himself, but for what the world had become without his hand holding it steady. His rule was ending. His enemies were circling. His allies were disappearing. And the son meant to inherit his throne was not the kingmaker he needed. The dying king sat in his wooden chair, surrounded by ghosts, old soldiers, old secrets, old sins, and understood the brutal truth. Empires do not die with a roar. They die with a slow, quiet unraveling, just like the man who built them. In the end, Raymond Patriarca did not die the way Hollywood said mob bosses should. There was no ambush at a street corner, no hail of bullets in a dim restaurant, no final dramatic standoff with federal agents. Instead, the man who once ruled New England's underworld with a cold, unblinking authority met his fate in the quietest room of his Providence home. A room that smelled of old furniture, sickness, and the distant memories of an empire he spent a lifetime controlling. For decades, Patriarca had dictated the fate of men with the flick of a hand, a nod, or a single whispered command. But on the night he died, the only command that mattered was the one his heart refused to obey. The muscle that had beat in silent rhythm through riots, assassinations, betrayals, indictments, and wiretaps finally gave out. Not because of a rival, not because of revenge, but because time itself had caught up to him. Ironically, the heart was the one thing he had never mastered. The house was quiet, eerily so. No captains waiting in the hall.
No soldiers on standby.
No cars idling outside with their engines warm. For once, the telephone on the kitchen wall didn't ring with a frantic request, a coded warning, or a desperate plea. The empire that had once pulsed with constant movement now felt like a museum exhibit, frozen, untouched, hollow. In his final hours, witnesses said Patriarca seemed less like a kingpin and more like a man who had been living inside his own legend for so long he'd forgotten where the story ended and the truth began. His breath was shallow, his skin pale, his voice, once razor-sharp and feared across 6 states, shrank to a faint whisper. He wasn't calling for his men. He wasn't asking for protection. He wasn't preparing his final order. He was simply fading. When the doctor pronounced him dead, the house remained still. No gunman burst in. No sirens wailed. The neighborhood didn't even know the shadow over its streets had lifted. The silence was startling, almost disrespectful. How could the fall of such a powerful man be so uneventful? But that silence carried weight. It was the kind of silence that holds a closing chapter. The kind that sinks into the walls, into the floorboards, into the legacy of the man who had built an empire on secrecy and fear. News traveled slowly at first. A few whispered phone calls. A couple of shocked murmurs from old-timers who had seen the rise long before they witnessed the fall. But by sunrise, the underworld had absorbed the truth. The quiet king was gone. Across New England, reactions were mixed. Some old associates lit cigarettes in silence, pondering their own mortality. Others felt a weight lift from their shoulders, a pressure they didn't realize they were still carrying. Younger criminals, who had grown up hearing stories about Patriarca's iron-fisted rule, simply nodded. Legends die, they thought. But the streets remain. Yet even they couldn't deny one simple reality. Nothing would ever be the same. For years, Patriarca had been the invisible spine holding the criminal world upright. Even when age, illness, and legal battles forced him to retreat from the front lines, his name still commanded respect. His presence alone kept rival factions from tearing at each other's throats. His authority kept Boston from erupting into chaos. His systems, numbers, loans, bookmaking, unions ran like veins through the region, carrying illicit profits from one corner of the Northeast to the other. But now those veins were clogged.
Severed. Starved.
Power shifts began the moment his death was confirmed. Captains questioned loyalties. Old grudges resurfaced. The structure that Patriarca had spent a lifetime engineering began to fracture, like glass dropped on concrete. Some men tried to keep the empire together, but without the strategist, the architect, the man who balanced fear and discipline with surgical precision, everything quickly spiraled. The truth was painful, but undeniable. Raymond Patriarca didn't just rule New England's Mafia, he was New England's Mafia. He had molded it after himself, disciplined, quiet, ruthlessly efficient. But in doing so, he built something that could not survive without him. His son could not fill the vacuum. His successors lacked his cunning, his restraint, his ability to maintain order through sheer presence. The criminal landscape transformed overnight, splintering into chaos as new players emerged, hungry for territories the old man had kept tightly guarded for decades. The FBI watched the unraveling with quiet satisfaction. They had chased Patriarca for years, trailing his shadow across states, tapping phones, bugging offices, decoding cryptic conversations that never seemed to give them enough. But they always knew, if they could outlast the man, they could outlast the empire. They were right. By the end of the year, the once mighty Patriarca crime family looked more like a collection of fading memories than a cohesive force. What had taken decades to build collapsed in months. Men who once walked tall under the protection of the quiet king now had to fend for themselves. Some fled. Some fell. Some died. The silence he had enforced for so long began to swallow everything he had created. And that was the final irony. Patriarca believed in silence as power. Silence as protection. Silence as strategy. But in death, silence became something else entirely. It became an eraser. Within a generation, many in New England knew his name as a footnote, a rumor, a ghost that haunted police records and whispered stories from old-timers sitting outside social clubs. The empire he built, perfected, and ultimately doomed became a cautionary tale, a fading echo of the last era when one man could control an entire region with nothing but a glance and a whisper. His legacy lived on, but only in fragments. Old FBI tapes. Underground folklore. Stories told in late-night bars by men who swore they once sat in the same room as the Quiet King. But the truth was simple. When Raymond Patriarca died, the last unified mafia empire of New England died with him. And the silence he ruled with became the silence that buried his name. But if you think the story ends here, you're wrong. Because the fall of one king didn't end the war, it ignited a new one. The vacuum left behind unleashed chaos, betrayal, and a blood-soaked power struggle unlike anything New England had ever seen. And what happened next? That's a story even darker than the one you just heard. Stay with me, the next chapter will shock you. If you enjoy true crime stories told like a movie, subscribe to Crime Syndicate Tales, where power always has a price.